want to get on to the other articles now. This recording will be quite a bit longer, but it contains all the other three that you'll be asked about on the quiz and on your comprehension exercise. This is 1 year later, as you can tell, Loftus by herself. And in there, she has an interesting sort of sidebar about a piece of research that she did that wasn't published. And the writing in this particular article is a little bit breezier, but it's still quite interesting. So, 40 people were interviewed about headaches and about headache products under the belief that they were participating in market research on these products. And two of the questions were crucial to the experiment. One asked about the products other than currently being used. So, in terms of the total number of products, how many products have you tried? 1, 2, or 3? Or, for a separate group of participants, in terms of the total number of headache products that you've tried, how many other products have you tried? 1, 5, or 10? The 1, 2, 3 participants claim to have an average of 3.3. The 1, 5, 10 average of 5.2. And of course, we see statistical significance there, which really begs a lot of interesting questions. Apparently, that the greater estimates caused them to go ahead and latch on to the 5 or 10 slightly more often, driving up that average considerably. Number 2A, do you get headaches frequently, and if so, how often? And 2B, do you get headaches occasionally? If so, how often? The frequently subjects reported an average of 2.2. The occasionally only 0.7. Which again, that wording, while it's much subtler than what we would encounter with respect to the car accident, and much less at stake, you might argue. In this case, it's certainly the verbiage led to different conclusions, and I think that is again, even though this study was unpublished, it's quite powerful in its suggestion. I would like to replicate something like that. Actually, she sort of threw that into the throwaway, but it seems like that's something that would lend itself to fruition. So on to the current events, and I know the writing here is a smidge small, but you can expand this somehow. Two examples from the published literature indicate that the wording of a question can influence a person's responses, of course, and we just witnessed one of those. In one study, in this particular one, 100 students viewed a short film. Oh, we just talked about that a second ago. So I want to get on to the second paragraph here. Excuse me, I got myself tied up. So in this 1975 article, she is effectively recounting what happened in the 1974 article. So I don't want to belabor that. Second paragraph down, we have some critical ideas with respect to the notion in this article of a presupposition. So thus the questions that they mentioned right above used only different articles with the or a. And one uses the when one assumes the object referred to may be familiar to the listener. So an investigator asks, did you see the broken headlight? Essentially says there was a broken headlight. Did you happen to see it? And that assumption there, that presupposition, is at the core of so much witness leading, which can have pernicious real-world effects, and of course also here in the laboratory. So I'm sorry for the crooked nature of these scans. I couldn't get a whole lot better, I'm afraid. So in experiment 1, again, they use large sample sizes, and these days I think we might use fewer, frankly. But 150 UW students in groups of various sizes were shown a film of a multi-car accident, and you can tell that theme. That after failing to stop at a stop sign makes a right turn into a stream of traffic. In an attempt to avoid the wreck, the cars in the oncoming traffic stop suddenly, and a 5-car wreck results. It lasts for less than a minute. At the end of the film, a 10-item questionnaire was administered. In a diagram of the situation, label the cars that ran the stop sign as A, and the other cars as B through F. Okay, well, fair enough. The first question asked, and excuse how crooked this is, was about the speed of car A in one of two ways. How fast was car A going when it ran the stop sign? Or how fast was car A going when it turned right? 75 subjects received stop sign, 75 received turn right. Of course, they had 150. The last question was identical for all subjects. Did you see a stop sign? Subjects responded by circling yes or no on the questionnaires. So it was implicated in the question when it ran the stop sign, not a stop sign, the stop sign. And the others were just turned right, and of course you know where the story's going. If we go down to the results section for this one particular item, 53% of the subjects that were quoted the stop sign, and really they should have included the in there, that's the paramount word, responded yes to the question. Did you see a stop sign for car A, whereas only 35 in the turn right group claimed to have seen the stop sign. The wording again of this presupposition where I say the, which effectively implies that it was there, into a question about an event asked immediately after the event can influence the answer to that subsequent question, which it certainly did. So that's a very core element, and just sort of bluffing, if you will, and letting it be known that you think that thing is there. And again, small font, but you've got this available to you. There are at least two explanations of this. The first is that when a subject, and again we'd say participant now, answers the initial stop sign question, he or she somehow reviews or strengthens, or in some sense makes more available certain representations corresponding to the stop sign. Later, when asked, did you see a stop sign, he or she responds on the basis of a strengthened memorial representation. In other words, just invoking the stop sign puts the image of a stop sign in your head, and then you falsely remember it having been there. Bottom line. The second idea is called construction. In answering the initial stop sign question, the subject may visualize or reconstruct that portion of the incident needed to answer the question, and accepts the presupposition. He introduces it into his visualization. So in either case, we have a pretty strong suggestion that people introduce. They have this contaminant in their memory based on that presupposition. And again, you can imagine the implications for law enforcement. After this, it gets away from Rex and takes a subtler tack, which I think is a meaningful expansion. So here's experiment 2. And again, they use a lot of experiments and a lot of participants. 40 undergraduates at UW, again, various sizes, were shown a 3-minute video taken from a student revolution. I think this is very clever. The sequence depicted disruption of a class by 8 demonstrators. The confrontation, which was relatively noisy, resulted in the demonstrators leaving the classroom. At the end of the videotape, the subjects received one of 2 questionnaires, which had one key question and 19 questions which were irrelevant. Half of the subjects were asked, and we'd say participants these days, was the leader of the 4 demonstrators who entered the classroom a male? The other half, the other 20 participants, were asked, was the leader of the 12 demonstrators who entered the classroom a male? The subjects responding by circling yes or no. 1 week later, we don't care whether it was a male or not, that's irrelevant. That was sort of to fill the storyline. 1 week later, all the participants returned, and without reviewing the video a second time, answered a series of 20 new questions, only one of which was relevant. The participants were urged to answer the questions from memory and not make inferences, and the critical question was, the only one of the 20 that we cared about, how many demonstrators did you see? Now you remember half of them a week prior were quoted 4, the other half were quoted 12, as though it were incidental, as though we were truly interested to know if the guy was, or the head demonstrator was a male. So, and again, I apologize for this quality. Subjects who had previously been asked the 12 question reported seeing an average of roughly 9 people, whereas those asked the 4 question recalled roughly 6.5 people. So you can see that the anchor that they were given a week earlier sort of pulled down their estimates with only 4, or pulled it up a smidge when it was 12. And of course we observed statistical significance there. And again, the actual number was 8. Now here's something else she says, and this is a fine detail of it, you could argue. One possibility is that some fraction of the participants remember the 12 or the number 4 specifically. If we remove those people that remembered the 12 or the 4 specifically, we still have those critical mean differences of about 8.5 and 6.67. So she thought of that. And I think, honestly, I think I might have remembered that. Some people just have a photographic memory or a fine memory for what appear to be incidental details. And even if we get rid of those 10% of people, as she describes, well, in that case, we still have this monster effect. So you can imagine, especially, let's take this situation that we just had in Dallas. What would be the implications of interviewing eyewitnesses? It's amazing that when and it's a very sad situation in Dallas, and of course we had other situations in Louisiana and Minneapolis, and going back to June 12th or so in Orlando, Florida, eyewitness accounts. And it's amazing how inaccurate some of those eyewitness accounts are after being reviewed in the fullness of time. So, not that that's anybody's fault, but might it be the case that suggestion is brought to bear in those situations? Yes, it certainly might be. So, these clever experiments, which are terribly clever. Back 40 odd years ago, it probably relied on them taking grainy 8-track videos, and I can imagine some of the lengths that they would have had to go to make these things happen would have been kind of complicated. But nonetheless, the effect was evoked. Her experiment 3. Again, with a gigantic sample size, I don't know where they get all these people. 150 students at UW viewed a video of another auto wreck and then answered 10 questions about the wreck. The critical one concerned the speed of a white sports car. Half of the subjects were asked how fast was the white sports car going when it passed the barn traveling along the country road, and how fast was the white sports car going when it traveled along the country road. And there was no barn there. So all of the participants returned a week later, and without viewing the tape a second time, answered 10 new questions. The final one, the only one that counted, did you see a barn? Of the subjects earlier exposed to the question containing the false presupposition of a barn, where it said the barn, 17.3% responded yes when later asked, did you see a barn? Whereas only 3% saw it when they weren't given that presupposition. A huge difference, of course, as the significance test reveals there at the bottom. Now, it might be worth mentioning, for what it's worth, for the ones that got the barn, and here's the question again, how fast was the white sports car going when it passed the barn? A week later, they come back, remember there is no barn, and they're asked, did you see a barn? Only 17.3% responded yes. And that's some fraction of 75, of course. I figured that out pretty quick. It's worth mentioning, not for nothing as they say, that 82.7% said no. So one could argue that there's a piece of good news in here, and the participants are somewhat discerning. They have a capacity, by and large, for detecting struggling for the word, but untruths, if you will, or detecting the truth of the matter. So if it was 90%, we might say, my gosh, humans have no capacity to discern the truth of the matter. They're very easily led by suggestion. That's not really the case. We still have a solid 4 out of 5 that recognize the truth of the matter based on visual memory. But some significant fraction, let's call it 1 out of 5, were misled by the presupposition, where virtually none saw the barn if there were no presupposition. So I think that's a good take-home message. One of the things I like about both Loftus articles is that their simplicity. They're very well written up. The introductions are short by necessity. Frankly, there wasn't a whole lot to introduce. They were pretty new concepts. And the manner in which they're executed, the stats, for those of you that have your ear to the ground on stats, are fairly interpretable. And certainly for those of you that have no background in stats, you would say, well, they are... I can sort of understand at least the interpretation of the results, even if I don't quite get the inferentials. So with that, I'll go ahead and go on to the next article that is, how do I want to put it? less overtly experimental and more of a state of the industry. Um, this is Schacter 2001 Part 1. This is a very good book that I've owned for many years that describes the fallibility of memory, as you can see in your syllabus. And it's one of the best books I've used. In fact, the title of the book, I'm looking at it on my shelf right now, The 7 Sins of Memory. And Daniel Schacter is of the mind that we have so many fallible parts that we simply can't avoid making mistakes of memory. So I think a lot of what he has written about here in his article is fairly direct. And he has some things in it that are terribly prescient, and comments on memory mistakes that we all make, such as deja vu, as he mentions in the course of the article. And also, something that I would have you pay attention to, that I think this is quite fascinating, that we'll return to later, is the tragedy in Oklahoma City. And some of you are maybe too young to even remember this, now that I think about it. In April 1995, there was an act of domestic terrorism. A young former soldier named Timothy McVeigh, who had, in common with a few other types, people of his sort, had some obscure anger toward the government about a myriad of things, and decided to enact terrorism against a federal building in Oklahoma City in response to that. Among his grievances was the Waco standoff that had happened exactly 2 years to the day prior. I want to say that date is April 19th of 93, and Oklahoma City was April 19th of 95. But irrespective of what the antecedents were to this situation, Timothy McVeigh, the incident in question, has caused us to reflect on some errors of memory. We'll focus on Timothy himself, in fact, who was executed in 2011, I believe, a little bit later. But there's an interesting anecdote in there that talks about one of the 7 sins of memory. And if you'll indulge me for a second here, I think this is an interesting passage. So, if you remember, as he says, and I'm sorry the font's so small, but you've got a copy of it, the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 probably recalls the failed search for a second person that was ostensibly with McVeigh. And at the time that this happened, it was wild speculation that there was a second person. McVeigh was apprehended, I think, within 2 hours. On an, ironically, as you'll see later, an unrelated charge. He was traveling due north somewhere in Oklahoma, and he was pulled over. I think his brake lights were out on his older car. He had a 22-year-old vehicle, and the brake lights were out, and I forget something else, but he wound up getting arrested for that. But the arresting officer did not make the connection between him and Oklahoma City bombing, and it was through other factors that they finally got to him. But anywho, how did they ever consider that there was a second person involved? The FBI mounted a nationwide manhunt for a second suspect they believed accompanied McVeigh when he rented the van that had the explosive devices in it at Elliott's body shop in Kansas 2 days before the bombing, rather. An artist's sketch of John Doe depicting a square-faced man with dark hair and a stocky build was at the core of that. So after tracing, next paragraph, McVeigh's rental van, the FBI interviewed employees at Elliott's body shop. A secretary and the shop owner recalled that only one man, McVeigh by himself, rented the van April 17th, 95, 2 days before the bombing, and made his reservation under a pseudonym, Robert Kling. The mechanic who watched the transaction recalled seeing 2 men. So I got a conflict there. One fit McVeigh, and the other one was shorter and stockier, dark-haired, etc., with a tattoo. So they searched for this other fella, this other John Doe. Of course, is a mass homicide. After tracing McVeigh's rental van, the FBI interviewed employees at the wrong place. So, next paragraph down. The source of Kensinger's memory, however, appears to lie in an unrelated visit to Elliot's body shop a day later, when Army Sergeant Michael Hurtig, an innocent person, had nothing to do with it, and his friend Todd Bunting also rented a van in Kensinger's presence. Hurtig, like McVeigh, was tall and fair. Bunting was short and stockier, wore a blue cap, etc. The bottom line is he confused the memory of two van renters, and through no fault of his own, he did the best he could. He had the FBI chasing a person essentially that didn't exist. This other person was innocent. He had nothing to do with the Oklahoma City bombing. So this is one of the clever anecdotes that Schacter mentions by way of introduction. He wants you to get used to the notion of the fallibility of memory, and have a toe in the water suggestion of those things, and which I really enjoy. Now, this Oklahoma City case lends itself to another piece of memory fallibility on behalf of McVeigh himself, where McVeigh himself made a couple of errors in his hapless getaway. And again, I mentioned this before, but he was apprehended within 2 hours on something unrelated, which I think you would hazard a guess he didn't expect to be. In fact, he would have gotten away with it had his car had brake lights. He didn't bother to check that out, and sure enough, thank goodness, he was apprehended. So after initiating, let's see, they were elected. Oh yeah, after initiating the unsuccessful manhunt for the elusive second person, the FBI agents reviewed records of Hurtig and Bunting's visit. They concluded that John Doe 2 was Private Todd Bunting, guy with no connection to the incident, and that misattribution occurred. So one of the 7 deadly sins of memory, as Schacter describes it, will be misattribution. I hear something and I misattribute it to something else, as we're going to see constantly throughout life. For instance, someone may misattribute a memory for a major event that they had. Speaking of misattributing things, for instance, if someone happened to be alive the day President Kennedy was killed, November 22nd, 1963, they might tell a story, and they might say, I'll never forget, President Kennedy was killed. The announcement came out about 1 o'clock Central Time, Dallas Time, 2 o'clock Eastern. And they let us out of school instantly, us children. And then we also learned, everybody was so upset, the nation was so stricken, that school was going to be let out the next day too. So we're going to get the rest of that day off and also be out of school the next day too. Well, somebody might tell that story in all sincerity, and they might really believe it. But if they did tell that story, they'd be mistaken, and we know that they would be mistaken because, as it happens, November 22nd, 1963 was a Friday. So, in that case, school would have been out anyway. Now, would somebody be telling a fib if they told that story? No, but they may have had the suggestion given to them by somebody else. So you can imagine how the emotion at the time, the president is killed. Just awful that is. And not only was it the loss of a president, which is a human being, and we are talking about a murder. At that point in time, it was also entirely within the realm of possibility from Americans' perspective that this was an act of war by the Soviet Union, that we couldn't rule that out. Things were pretty bad between the U.S. and the Soviet Union at that point. So you not only had the immediate awfulness of President Kennedy's death, but then this rather horrible feeling that this was an harbinger of awful, awful things to come in terms of war. Thankfully, it turned out not to be true. I think the evidence strongly suggests the Soviet Union had nothing to do with it. I happen to believe it was Oswald, but nonetheless, at the time that happened, the gravity of the situation would cause people to believe extraordinary things that are in fitting with the narrative, such as school being let out several days in a row, etc. So let's see, I'm on the next slide. I just got a little bit lost. So again, this kind of mistaken identification is not unprecedented. Here's something else that's quite interesting. I hope you'll find it interesting. In a famous case from the 50s, a British ticket agent robbed at gunpoint later identified an innocent sailor as a gunman. The sailor had previously purchased tickets from the same agent who had, again, misattributed the familiarity of the sailor's face to the robbery. In a later incident, the psychologist Donald Thompson was accused of rape based on a victim's detailed memory of his face. Thompson was cleared because he had an impeccable alibi. He was in the midst of a live television interview. The victim had been watching the show and misattributed the memory of his face to the rapist, as sad as that is. So you can imagine, I could misattribute someone's statement about the day Kennedy died. Oh yeah, I remember we were all out of school for 2 straight days. I take that statement on as my own memory. And it's such a fallible device that we have. We take on others' whimsical, not necessarily reckless, not malevolent, but whimsical statement on as our own. And then we incorporate it as a memory seamlessly without realizing it. So there's that idea of misattribution. I'm going to get onto one other thing. So Thompson, the psychologist, and the British sailor were fortunate enough to escape wrongful imprisonment, but in other cases, who knows? You can imagine things that rely on eyewitness testimony. There was a person that was nearby that we misattributed. We misattribute their face, and we implicate them as the criminal. So one of Loftus's and of course Schachter's ultimate points is that the fallibility of human memory is awful, and we would like to not rely on it for things. So first, according to estimates made in the late 80s, each year in the U.S. more than 75,000 criminal trials were decided on the basis of eyewitness testimony. Can you imagine? Second, a recent analysis of 40 cases in which DNA evidence established the innocence of a wrongfully imprisoned person. In other words, exonerated them after they were imprisoned. 36 of those 40 involved mistaken eyewitness identification. Now, were these witnesses wrong on purpose? Do they have some sort of revenge tactic against the defendant? No, of course, probably not. They were acting with sincerity, but nonetheless, they had a awful problem with misattribution. That's our one major sin. So, or the major sin that's identified in this part 1, which I really find fascinating. And thankfully, I have not been on trial for anything, because I do wonder, could an innocent person, a completely innocent person, find himself or herself in considerable trouble? The suggestion is yes. In these 40 cases, 36 of them whistling Dixie, and next thing you know, they're in big trouble for something they probably they did not do. So these chilling numbers create a sense of urgency regarding the need to understand the better nature of eyewitness attribution. So misattribution rather. And this misattribution is at the core of this. So one thing I'll say is that if Loftus and people like her have made a contribution, is that they brought these things to the forefront. And I know some of you don't necessarily follow this show. There's a major TV news show called 60 Minutes on CBS every Sunday, and Loftus has appeared on there 3 times. I don't know that if anyone else, maybe outside of politics, that has appeared on 60 Minutes 3 different times over the years to talk about some of the findings of her basic research. What I mean by basic is lab-based research, but also the extrapolations that are made from her research onto other things, including the criminal trial world. So, a couple other things, whether unconscious or not, the kinds of eyewitness misidentifications observed in cases such as John Doe and others fit well with research showing that people often have sketchy recollections of the precise details of previous experiences, when and where they encountered a person, etc. And that vagueness, which we can't avoid, creates the fertile soil for source misattributions. I can't remember where I saw something, but I know it looks familiar. I can't remember where I heard something, so I assume I remember it. I don't remember being told that school was out for 2 straight days in November of '63. I assume I remember that it was, and then I go on and tell the story for eternity, like that. Again, there's no malice attendant to that. So psychologists refer to this linking process as memory binding, gluing together what may have been unrelated things, the components of an experience, into a unitary whole. And when individual parts of an experience are retained but the binding fails, the stage is set for those source misattributions. So these binding failures may contribute to memory confusions between events and the ones that we think about or imagine, or ones that are told to us. There's a clever line of research that has to do with performing and watching and imagining. And for people that happen to have lower frontal lobe functioning, they tend to get confused more easily. So we'll sit with them and we'll say things along the lines of, I want you to imagine yourself putting the paperclip from one small box to another, moving the paperclip from one small box to another, etc. And then in other cases, I want you to actually do some rudimentary task like that. And we bring these people back a week later, and they often can't remember what they actually did and what they imagine themselves doing. And that's especially true with someone with frontal lobe deficit and those other sorts. Other sorts of things that contribute to our performance. For those of you that are not really into the biology of the brain, and I don't insist that you have the great knowledge, but the frontal lobe is arguably the part of the brain that is in charge of this governance and really helps us make decisions and bring active working memory to bear. And if that part is depleted or not very robust to start with, we tend to have these errors of memory more. So, and in fact, we're going to mention biology here in a second. Is there anything else I want to say from Schacter? Here we go. Healthy elderly adults who perform poorly on tests that are sensitive to frontal lobe abnormalities also tend to be prone to these source misattributions. So let's say I was, I don't know, a senior in high school in 1963. That would put me born in 1945, so that'd be what, 71 years old? We could round up and call that elderly, although it's not extremely elderly. In that case, if I had some sort of frontal lobe deficit, I might be more likely to tell this story, this mistaken incident about what happened on the day of November 22nd, 1963, etc. So that frontal lobe deficit is a key contributor there. Also, something more from my generation. I happen to be alive. I was born in 1970. In 1986, when the first space shuttle had an accident, it essentially exploded. And there have been two space shuttle incidents in U.S. history. The first was January of 86, and then fast forward, I'll do the math on that, 17 years to February of 03. But in 86, it was a painful incident because there were people on there that weren't regular astronauts, including the teacher of the year. I'm embarrassed, I can't remember her name, but Sally Ride was it, I believe. Anywho, it was an awful incident, and people might misremember things about that. For instance, if people told you that they saw it on live TV, chances are they're mistaken. And the reason that they would be mistaken is because the only place that had it live was CNN. Everyone else had it, all the networks had it on tape delay about a half hour later. So a major national event like that is just as vulnerable to source misattribution, especially if we have that frontal lobe deficit. Where's the frontal lobe, by the way? It's directly behind your forehead. So if you can imagine your brain inside your skull, that frontal lobe, the aspect of our humanity that is most human, that is the engine that drives your basic intellect above that of animals, is that frontal lobe that's right behind your forehead and appropriately named the frontal lobe. So I want to just mention a few things from LeDoux, not overdoing it. I think for the sake of completeness in this opening section of articles, I've got the two experimental articles from Loftus that are, I think, quite direct. I've got the Schacter business, which is less empirical, more anecdotal, but compelling in itself, and we'll have several sections from Schacter. I love Schacter, Harvard educated, of course, and he's a professor at Harvard. And then we have LeDoux that touches base on a little bit of biology, and I think, and I do mean a little, this is the only allusion of any sort that we have to biology at all, in terms of um, the the entire gamut of false memories. But it has to be mentioned. What are the component parts of memories with respect um, to the brain? Um, so here we go. I want to mention a few things, and of course I have already alluded pretty heavily to the frontal lobe. Um, so we have this idea of synapses, etc. Um, and I want to get to this graph. So one could argue, and this note there is a bit of a metaphor from LeDoux from this chapter, um, that everything that we know, our semantic knowledge, and a lot of our procedural knowledge, is in that outer cerebral cortex, um, and is contained physically. So it's like if I mention Pythagoras to you, um, what does that mean to most people? Well, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That is a physical memory. And if you picked up a pencil and you sat down with some graph paper and you began fumbling around with it, and somebody gave you some geometry homework out of the blue, in that case, that a squared plus b squared would come to the front of your mind, if you will, and it would be re-invoked. Or if I said, hey, what's the chemical symbol for gold? And a lot of people know that for some reason. They say AU. Or what was the planet that got demoted and then re-promoted back to a planet? Well, that was Pluto, etc. Who was the president of the United States that by legend had wood teeth? Oh, that was George Washington. All of those semantic memories, all of those incidental facts that you have, are physically stored via synaptic connections between neurons, and they're evinced once you go to think of something. And the mention of George Washington may have been the first that you've had in 10 years, or 25 years. It's not that George Washington's on your mind all the time. But nonetheless, these are things that are re-invoked physically when we have a memory that comes to the forefront. So, in this case, pardon me, getting distracted here. For example, in life, and not just in cartoons, rodents really are afraid of cats. This is true of rats and mice living in the wild, but also of rats studied in labs, of course. And although lab rats come from breeding colonies that have been isolated from cats for many generations, any one of them, upon seeing a cat for the first time, will freeze. And you could say, and this is one of our comprehension exercise questions, this is Mother Nature at work, since the rat and his immediate ancestors never had the opportunity to actually learn from personal experience that cats are dangerous. So in other words, there was no synaptic connection there that came based on experience. I have a synaptic connection that hoses can be dangerous. When I was a little kid, I had one of those really heavy brass ends of a hose that made the water come out really strongly, if you know what I'm talking about. And it got away from me and hit me on my bare toe, and really caused a rather awful injury to my toe. And in that case, I learned to be afraid. I made a synaptic connection of those heavy brass hose, I don't know what you call it, that makes the water come out strong. It must nozzle. I learned to be afraid of those nozzles. And on the other hand, do we have some other reflexive connections that are strictly nature and not a product of their environment? So someone might say that, and if this behavior is not just specific to rats, this freezing, as we mentioned before, but also it could be part of humans. So to recap what LeDoux said here, although rats come from breeding colonies that have been isolated from cats for many generations, upon seeing a cat for the first time, it'll freeze dead in its tracks. So why is that? Well, there might be a suggestion, and people at the Olympics 20 years ago may have made this suggestion. There was an explosion at the Olympics, and everyone in the vicinity was crouching motionless. Why is that? Well, if freezing became a genetically hardwired behavior And obviously, there's no way to know for sure, since we have no fossil record, of course. But a reasonable theory, you might say, instead of a hypothesis, is that freezing is a beneficial response when faced with a predator. The predators are going to have a hard time finding us if we're not moving around shaking the foliage, maybe. So in that case, they are less able to find us, and then freezing gives us a slightly better chance of surviving. Could that be genetically hardwired? Well, yes. And might that be part of, say, the hippocampus or something like that? Well, sure. So what is interesting is that, and I'm almost done here, freezing also occurs if a rat or other animal hears a sound that preceded an aversive stimulus, like some sort of classical conditioning paradigm. There's no predator around in this case, so how's the connection formed? The sound is a warning. Any rat that survives an encounter with a cat or other predator should store in its brain about the situation as much as possible, so that the next time the sounds or sights, etc., that precede the arrival of the cat, and they can be attended to in order to increase its chances of staying alive by engendering that freezing. So it learns to associate two actions in time. So there are, and this is at the core of the question that we're asked. There are two basic ways in which these kinds of processing might be wired up in the brain. First, a two-system operation might exist, with one system for responding to a species-typical genetically programmed danger, and another for learning about novel ones experienced by individuals in their lives. Or there might just be one system that takes care of both situations. Experiments show that it's likely to be the case that there's one system that takes care of both situations, and that was that figure 1.3. Well, actually, it's coming up in a second here. So, damage to a region of the brain called the amygdala eliminates the tendency for rats to freeze both to the cat and to the preceding sound. And the amygdala is responsible for emotions. This amygdala is a part of the brain system that controls freezing behavior and other defensive responses in threatening situations. Its synapses are wired by nature to respond to the cat, and by experience to respond the same way to dangers that are learned about in association with that cat or the shock or what have you. It's a wonderfully efficient way to do things. Rather than create a separate system to accommodate learning about new dangers, just enable the system that's already wired to detect dangers to be modifiable by experience. The brain then deals with novel dangers by taking advantage of this evolutional fine-tuning. So, in other words, when we have new things that we learn to be afraid of, like a sound that predicts a shock or a sound that predicts something aversive, that amygdala allows that fear response to take over, just as it would to things that were pre-programmed to be afraid of. For instance, there's a strong suggestion that humans and primates are pre-programmed, as it were, to be afraid of snakes. As you can imagine, those slithery little things are not our friends as a rule. So this graphic depiction here is you've got the innate threat and the learned threat that essentially go through the same fear system, which involves that amygdala, which of course is part of the limbic system. The amygdala is, in terms of size, if you look at your pinky, is about the size of the top third of your pinky, and it's buried well in that midbrain. It's let me take that back. It's part of the forebrain, but it's considerably below the cerebral cortex. So I know this has been a long segment. This is probably roughly a total of an hour's worth of recordings for this first reaction paper of the 6, or first comprehension exercise. But nonetheless, I wanted to hit the high points and let this first salvo be sort of a good buffet of hard experiments in the first 2 Loftus papers. Also the Schacter perspective on this notion of misattributions, and a little bit of biology within limits, mentioning the frontal lobe, mentioning the capacity of the amygdala to serve as a basis for memory. So I'll be in touch again soon. I'll have more of these recordings that'll come soon before the due dates of the comprehension exercises.